In the early morning hours of what began as a routine transit through the world's most volatile maritime choke point, the United States Navy faced a tactical nightmare that nearly rewrote the history of modern naval warfare. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow, sun-drenched corridor connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, serves as the jugular vein of the global energy economy. But for the commander of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, it is something far more treacherous. A geographic trap where the ocean's vastness shrinks to a claustrophobic lane. In this specific stretch of water, the maritime environment is defined by its constraints, a place where a 100,000-ton supercarrier can barely breathe, let alone execute the sweeping, high-speed maneuvers for which it was designed. There was nowhere to go. The attack that unfolded was not a random act of aggression, but a meticulously choreographed operation, rehearsed for months in the darkened rooms of coastal naval planning centers. The geometry of the engagement had been calculated in advance, accounting for the carrier's speed, the specific current of the strait, and the unique acoustic properties of these shallow, turbulent waters. Each of the three hostile submarines had taken its position in the dark, moving with a predatory patience that only underwater crews truly understand, waiting for weeks or months for exactly this moment. As the carrier moved into the heart of the channel, the trap finally closed. 3 weapons were in the water simultaneously, launched from 3 different directions in a coordinated salvo, designed so that evading one meant sailing directly into the path of another. The math governing the engagement was as brutal as it was simple. A vessel of that immense scale, operating in water that tight, against a salvo that coordinated, faced numbers that did not favor survival. It is a sobering reality of modern conflict that one more submarine, one more firing solution, or a single torpedo that refused to deviate from its track would have resulted in the most strategically catastrophic naval loss since the end of the Second World War. The carrier group had exactly 46 minutes from the moment of first contact to the final, echoing detonation in the deep. This was not a battle fought with the cinematic flash of missiles in the sky, but a silent, high-stakes chess match played out in the blue-black depths where 46 minutes separated a successful transit from a global catastrophe. This is the minute-by-minute account of what those 46 minutes actually look like on the front lines of a conflict that the world was never supposed to see. At 5:12 in the morning, the sea appeared completely calm, a glass-like surface reflecting the first hints of a pale dawn. The carrier moved through the strait in disciplined silence, a state of heightened readiness where electronic signatures are minimized to blend the massive whole into the background noise of the ocean. On the flight deck, the morning routine was already humming with the rhythmic precision of a well-oiled machine. Fuel crews checked lines, deckhands prepared the catapults, and the massive radar sweeps turned relentlessly above the island, searching the horizon for threats that had not yet materialized. There was nothing in the air and nothing on the surface. It was simply a warship doing what American carriers are built to do, projecting order in a place where order can disappear in a matter of seconds. However, beneath the surface, the first contact had already been made. It did not announce itself with a loud alarm or a sudden burst of speed. Instead, it was a single, faint acoustic trace, a rhythmic pulsing barely distinguishable from the background groan of the sea, picked up by a veteran sonar operator aboard one of the forward-deployed destroyers. The signature was low, structured, and deliberate, the unmistakable sound of a submarine crew that knows exactly what it is doing and is working desperately to remain unheard. The report moved through the formation with lightning speed, traveling from the destroyer's combat information center to the carrier's tactical command. The initial assessment was cautious, a possible submerged contact, bearing narrow, range uncertain. In the high-pressure environment of a carrier strike group, the most dangerous moments are almost always the quietest ones. And at this stage, nobody overreacted, they simply waited. By 5:14, the situation transitioned from a suspicion to a crisis. A second contact was detected, originating from a different angle and picked up by a different escort in a different sector entirely. The tactical display now showed 2 separate underwater signatures closing from opposite sides of the formation. Both crews were maintaining a level of acoustic discipline that only highly trained submariners can sustain under the intense pressure of an active engagement. The geometry of the encounter was now too precise for coincidence. The officers in the Combat Information Center stopped treating the detections as anomalies or ghost echoes. They began treating them as the opening move of a deliberate, multi-axis attack. The carrier's course shifted by degrees, a subtle adjustment intended to put distance between the hull and the projected intercept points. A ship of that size does not flinch or dart away. It shifts its weight with the slow, inevitable momentum of a mountain. At 5:16, the tactical picture darkened further. Airborne sensors, deployed by a hovering Seahawk helicopter, relayed a third contact. This one was farther out, sitting deeper and moving slower, holding its position with a clear intent to complete a lethal triangle around the carrier's projected path. 3 contacts, not scattered and not random, but perfectly coordinated. This was not surveillance or a standard show of force. This was a fully assembled ambush, already in position and waiting for the kill. The strike group responded instantly, transitioning to a full anti-submarine posture in a matter of seconds. Escort ships widened their screen, helicopters accelerated toward their launch points, and active sensors across the formation came online, bathing the water in pulses of energy. Internal communications became compressed, stripped of all but the most essential tactical data. In that moment, every officer in the CIC absorbed the same brutal reality. A United States aircraft carrier was transiting one of the narrowest choke points on Earth, with 3 hostile submarines closing beneath it from 3 different directions. Above, on the flight deck, the crew continued their work in the morning sun, largely unaware that the fight for their lives had already begun beneath the steel of the hull. At 5:18, the tactical situation took an even more ominous turn. One of the contacts vanished from the screens, not faded, but vanished entirely. In the world of anti-submarine warfare, a disappearing submarine is almost always more dangerous than one that remains detected. It does not signify a retreat. It signifies a repositioning, a move into a blind spot, or a new angle of attack that the defenders have not yet accounted for. The search parameters were widened immediately. Bearings were rechecked, and the nearest escort destroyer shifted its speed and angle to force a reacquisition of the target. When the signature finally reappeared, it was closer, having changed both depth and bearing to slip into a tighter line relative to the carrier's track. The intent was now undeniable. This was followed by the sound that ended the countdown to violence, the sharp, metallic acoustic event of a torpedo tube cycling open. It was a sound that trained ears identified without a moment's hesitation. The window for diplomacy or posturing had collapsed. The attack had started. At 5:21, the sonar net confirmed the worst-case scenario: torpedoes in the water. The reports from the sonar operators were delivered with a flat, cold professionalism that belied the stakes of the moment. Detection had officially become engagement. Seconds after the first launch, a second track appeared, then a third. The full geometry of the Iranian plan revealed itself all at once. 3 submarines in coordinated firing positions had launched simultaneously from separate sectors, a saturation attack designed to compress the strike group's reaction time to 0. In the confined waters of the Strait of Hormuz, such an attack is engineered to shatter formation discipline and overwhelm a defense before it can even take shape. Instead, the attack triggered a display of raw, kinetic naval power. The carrier came hard to course, its propulsion plant surging as the immense hull began carving a new line through the channel, churning white water into a violent wake. On the flight deck, sailors felt the massive shift beneath their boots. Aircraft handlers froze, equipment was locked down, and the entire mission of the ship changed in a heartbeat from power projection to raw survival. Around the carrier, the escorts moved with brutal precision, one destroyer accelerating into a blocking position to act as a physical and acoustic shield for the carrier's vulnerable flank. The mission was not glory, it was geometry. The goal was to break the angle of the incoming weapons and force them to choose smaller, faster targets instead of the 100,000-ton prize. For several seconds, the only sounds in the CIC were the clipped calls of bearings and ranges as the torpedoes closed the distance. The nearest torpedo wavered, its track bending fractionally as it was pulled toward the escort's decoy field, hunting through a chaotic mess of noise and wake turbulence for a clear acoustic return. It was a tiny deviation, but it was enough to prove that the defense was holding, if only by a thread. The second torpedo, however, held a tighter line, resisting the first layer of deception and continuing its run toward the carrier's midsection. On the bridge, officers calculated the impact of a near miss, the potential for a ruptured deck and a mass casualty event in the middle of the strait. At 5:25, the third torpedo, running ahead of the bow, remained the most lethal threat. The carrier drove its evasive turn with every ounce of power its reactors could provide, shifting its angle just enough to complicate the weapon's final firing solution. A destroyer on the outer screen pushed itself into the path one final time, throwing its own hull and noise into the acoustic field to distort the seeker's picture. At 5:26, the gamble paid off. The third torpedo faltered, its track bending away from the carrier's bow by a margin so small it was nearly invisible, before finally entering the decoy field and chasing a false solution into the void. The carrier had survived the first wave, not through luck, but because the system had held under maximum pressure. Every escort, every countermeasure, every sonar team, and every piece of naval doctrine had fired without a single critical failure. But there was no time for relief. 3 submarines were still in the water, and the posture of the strike group inverted instantly from defense to pursuit. A Seahawk helicopter went low and fast over the surface, dropping a dense pattern of sonobuoys to build a fresh, high-resolution picture of the underwater battlefield. The CIC was no longer reacting, it was constructing a kill grid. The most aggressive of the 3 submarines, having accelerated after its launch to regain a firing position, became the immediate priority. One escort switched to active sonar, sending sharp, unmistakable pulses into the water, a deliberate announcement of its position intended to force the submarine into a choice. Active sonar forces a submarine to either hold its course and risk precise localization, or maneuver and betray its position acoustically. The boat chose to move, and that movement made it visible. A firing solution solidified. A lightweight anti-submarine torpedo was dropped from the Seahawk, and the water soon answered with a deep, muffled detonation that pulsed through the hulls of every ship in the formation. The first threat had been neutralized. The second submarine had been the most patient, attempting to hide within the acoustic clutter of the seafloor and the shadows of the strait's irregular topography. But under the relentless pressure of active sonar pulses and overlapping sonobuoy patterns, even perfect stillness eventually becomes a tell. A fractional depth correction, a tiny trim adjustment, or a brief acoustic irregularity where nothing should have changed, that was enough. The destroyer caught the anomaly, the Seahawk confirmed it from above, and a second torpedo was launched. After a desperate attempt by the submarine to outrun the geometry of the trap, a second detonation rolled across the strait, heavier than the first. When the chaos cleared, the contact was gone, not fading or masked, but confirmed as a kill. By 5:41, the strait had gone quiet, the heavy, expectant quiet of a battlefield where the initial dust has settled, but the danger remains. One submarine was still unaccounted for, a patient predator with nothing left to lose, likely sliding into one final firing angle. The carrier kept moving, its escorts reshaping their formation into a containment corridor to eliminate any remaining escape lanes. The Seahawk extended its search field, building overlapping search boxes ahead of the carrier's track. A patient submarine waiting for the carrier to settle is the most dangerous kind, and no one mistook the silence for victory. Then, the final submarine made a mistake, a tiny irregularity in its propeller rhythm that was caught by a single destroyer and confirmed by the overhead sensors. The last Iranian vessel was not fleeing. It was sliding across the carrier's forward corridor, searching for one last shot. At 5:47, the Seahawk moved into its final attack position, utilizing a tactical picture that was now perfectly clear. The release was procedural and irreversible. The torpedo struck the water, and despite the submarine's sharp maneuvers to escape, the geometry of the engagement was now entirely in the favor of the Americans. The final detonation was the heaviest of the morning, a hammer blow of sound that signaled the end of the engagement. No propulsion signature remained. No disciplined trace reappeared from the blast field. At 5:50, the carrier continued its transit, its deck intact and its command structure unbroken. The ambush that had begun with 3 submarines closing beneath the hull had ended with the strike group in total control of the strait. There were no speeches or celebrations, only the cold recognition of how close the margin of victory had been. The carrier had not survived because it was invulnerable, but because a complex, multi-layered system of men and machines had functioned without a single critical failure for 46 minutes of extreme stress. This engagement serves as a stark reminder of the evolving nature of maritime power. The Strait of Hormuz remains a place where the world's most advanced warships can be brought to the brink by the simple, brutal math of a coordinated ambush. As the strike group moved into the open water of the Arabian Sea, the strategic lesson remained. The carrier survived because the system held, but the question that now haunts naval strategists is where that system eventually breaks. Is the answer to that question being calculated right now in the narrow, dark water of the next strait, by crews adding one more submarine to the geometry and waiting for the next carrier to arrive? The 46 minutes of Hormuz may have ended in a tactical victory, but the silent war beneath the waves continues, defined by a constant search for the one flaw in the armor of the world's most powerful naval force. In the high-stakes environment of global power projection, there is no such thing as a permanent victory, only the constant, vigilant maintenance of a defense that can never afford to fail. The carrier transit of the Strait of Hormuz will be remembered not for the shots fired, but for the precision with which a catastrophe was averted. It stands as a testament to the fact that in modern warfare, the difference between a mission accomplished and a national tragedy is often measured in seconds, degrees, and the unwavering discipline of those who watch the dark water. The geopolitical implications of this event are still being analyzed in capitals around the world, as the vulnerability of the global energy supply chain is once again laid bare. The strait, less than 30 miles wide at its narrowest point, remains a theater where the massive and the minuscule collide. On one side, a nuclear-powered symbol of American hegemony. On the other, small, silent vessels utilizing the geography of their own backyard to challenge that power. This clash of philosophies, saturation versus precision, stealth versus detection, will define the next generation of naval doctrine. For the sailors who lived through those 46 minutes, the experience was a visceral reminder of the fragility of their environment. The transition from a calm morning routine to a fight for survival is the reality of serving in the world's choke points. As the carrier group moves toward its next objective, the lessons of the three submarines will be integrated into every drill and every tactical brief. The system worked this time, but the margin was paper thin. In the silent geometric world of underwater combat, the next ambush is already being planned, and the next 46 minutes may tell a very different story. The resilience of the carrier strike group is its greatest asset, yet its size remains its greatest liability in the tight corridors of the world's oceans. This duality is the central challenge of the modern Navy, a balance of power that must be struck every time a carrier enters a narrow sea. The events of this morning have proven that while the carrier is not invulnerable, it is protected by a shield of technology and training that remains the standard of the world. However, as the weapons in the water become more sophisticated and the coordination of the attackers becomes more refined, that standard will be tested again and again. The silence that now hangs over the Strait of Hormuz is not the silence of peace, but the silence of a reset. The moment before the next calculation begins. The world watches the surface, but the true struggle for dominance is happening in the deep, where the math is brutal and the consequences are absolute. This report has documented the reality of that struggle, a 46-minute window where the future of naval warfare was glimpsed in the shadow of an ambush. The carrier sails on, but the waters of the strait remain as dangerous as ever, a reminder that in the world of high-stakes geopolitics, the narrowest paths are often the most treacherous. The system held, the geometry was defeated, and for now, the carrier remains the undisputed sovereign of the seas, but the shadows in the dark water are not going away. They are simply waiting for the next opportunity to close the trap.